It begins with a portrait, a woman in a high lace collar, her eyes heavy-lidded, her lips pressed thin with the weight of her bloodline. The frame is gold, but the expression is not regal. It is tired, resigned, almost inhuman. Her name was Juana la Loca, Juana the Maid, the daughter of Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon, the mother of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Her blood was the purest of her age, or so the chroniclers wrote, and perhaps that was the curse. Because purity in the language of dynasties has always meant one thing, keeping the blood within the family. A dangerous dance of cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, nephew to aunt, generation after generation. Not for love, for power, for thrones, for control, and what begins as strategy often ends in tragedy. You see, inbreeding was never a secret among Europe's royal houses. It was a boast, a proof of divine right. The idea that their blood was not like ours, that through careful selection they remained closer to the gods. But the truth is far darker. As the lineages twisted tighter, the bodies began to betray them. So did the minds. The Habsburg jaw became an icon of deformity. The Bourbon madness a whispered warning. And, among the women, the queens, princesses, duchesses, the cost was often paid in isolation, in suffering, in lives cut short. Let's begin with Juana herself. Married at 16 to Philip the Handsome, her cousin. By 24, she was a widow. By 25, a prisoner in her own castle, declared insane by her own father. She would live locked away for 46 years. The official story, melancholy, madness. But those who saw her said something else. A woman broken by forces beyond her control. Forces older than politics. Forces written in blood. And Juana was not alone. Across Europe, similar stories repeat. Margaret of Austria, married to her own uncle, her body twisted with congenital scoliosis. Maria Anna of Spain, her fertility destroyed by the same Habsburg genes meant to preserve her rank. Anna of Austria, mother of Louis XIV, her fragile health and endless miscarriages whispered about behind lace fans. The pattern is impossible to ignore, and it only worsens as you trace the lines deeper. Consider the Spanish Habsburgs. By the time of Charles II, the bloodline had looped so tightly that his pedigree chart looks like a snake eating its own tail. Charles, king by birth, was born with a deformed jaw so severe he could not chew. He drooled constantly. His body was frail. His mind, well, that was the greatest tragedy. Unable to produce an heir, haunted by visions, prey to every charlatan and priest who promised a cure. When he died at 38, Spain's empire cracked apart. His autopsy revealed a heart the size of a peppercorn, a head full of water. Now imagine the women of that court, raised from birth to serve as vessels, to produce heirs, to preserve the blood, knowing full well what that blood carried, fearing each pregnancy, watching sisters and cousins die young or linger in pain. Yet the cycle continued. Why? Because marriage was power. And in a world ruled by dynasties, alliances mattered more than health. The church sanctioned it. The court demanded it. And the women, they had no choice. Even today, their portraits remain. Alabaster skin, dark eyes, stiff bodies clad in brocade. But if you look closer, you'll see the signs. The elongated jaws, the sloped shoulders, the too pale complexions, the ghosts of genetics. And so we must ask, how many royal tragedies were truly madness? And how many were simply the inevitable cost of breeding too close for too long? You probably wouldn't have survived in that world. But if you think that's the darkest secret, just wait. The next part of this story will make you question everything you thought you knew about royal blood. Before we continue, if this has you intrigued, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment. There are truths here that few dare to speak, and it only gets stranger from here. But now tell me, would you risk your children's lives for a throne? Would you marry within your own bloodline if it meant power or survival? Let us know in the comments. The story shifts to France. The glittering court of Versailles, the Sun King, Louis XIV, striding through endless mirrored halls. But behind the gold and the silk, another truth lived, in the bloodlines of his wives, his mistresses, his daughters. Marie-Thérèse of Austria, Queen of France, wife to the most powerful monarch in Europe, and his own cousin. Her marriage was meant to cement an alliance between Spain and France. But it came with a price. Generations of Habsburg inbreeding flowed in her veins. Portraits of the young queen show a round face, heavy jaw, downcast eyes. She arrived in France at 14, speaking no French, terrified of her husband's infamous temper and endless infidelities. Worse, she came with the shadow of infertility, a curse for any queen. Indeed, her pregnancies were difficult, fraught with miscarriages and stillbirths. Of 6 children, only 1 survived infancy. Court whispers blamed her Spanish blood, a polite euphemism for inbreeding. Behind the fans, courtiers snickered about her Spanish weakness. It wasn't just Marie-Thérèse. The French court was rife with intermarriage. Noble houses, desperate to keep lands and titles intact, often arranged marriages between cousins or even closer relations. The result? Generations of fragile heirs plagued by congenital defects. Considère Louise Élisabeth d'Orléans, daughter of the Duke of Orléans, herself a product of cousin marriage. Married off to the Spanish court at age 11. Yes, 11. Letters from the time describe her as a sickly child, prone to fainting, plagued by migraines. She would be dead by age 23. No heirs. And then there was Princess Henrietta of England, married to her cousin Philippe III, Duke of Orléans. Their shared ancestry traced back through the tangled roots of the Bourbon and Stuart dynasties. Henrietta, known for her beauty and charm, suffered from fragile health her entire life. After years of illness, she died suddenly at 26. Some whispered poison, but modern historians suspect otherwise. A fatal complication from the genetic burden she carried. Why did these patterns persist? In part because the church encouraged it. Marriage dispensations, permissions for close kin to marry, were routinely granted by the Pope for political reasons. Blood purity was seen as a virtue, not a risk, and queens, no matter their fears, had little say. Imagine the pressure: marry your cousin, produce a male heir, do it quickly, or face disgrace. Each pregnancy a gamble, not just for the child's life, but for your own. The women of these courts lived in constant anxiety, surrounded by doctors and midwives, their bodies treated like royal property. Some rebelled, subtly. Madame de Montespan, Louis XIV's mistress, refused to allow her daughters to marry their cousins. Better a healthy commoner than a cursed king, she once reportedly said. But most had no such power, and so the bloodlines narrowed further. The results were often tragic. Weak heirs, dynastic collapse, endless wars of succession, all because pride and politics demanded marriages that no sane doctor would endorse today. But what if it wasn't just pride? In some circles, a darker theory emerged, that the old royal houses sought not just to preserve their blood, but to concentrate it, to create something beyond human. A lineage so pure, so ancient, that it would unlock hidden powers. Alchemy of the flesh. Madness, perhaps. But in the journals of certain court astrologers and mystics, we find cryptic notes. The union of the red and the white shall birth the eternal king. Some took this to mean alchemical gold. Others, something far stranger. Could it be that beneath the tragedy of inbreeding lay a deeper plan, an attempt to create a bloodline that could not die? You probably wouldn't have survived in that palace either. And if you think the French were extreme, just wait. The next part of this story takes us to the darkest chambers of the Habsburg Empire, where the price of pure blood was paid in agony. But before we dive in, if this has opened your eyes, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. There are secrets yet to uncover, and your voice matters here. Tell me, would you defy the church and your king to protect your children? Would you risk exile to marry for love instead of power? Share your thoughts below. Some royal families weren't just known for their political power. They became infamous for how far they were willing to go to preserve it. Bloodlines had to remain pure, Dynasties had to remain unbroken, and in this brutal logic, the lives of daughters became bargaining chips in a dangerous game of control, secrecy, and genetic obsession. Let's take the Habsburgs, perhaps Europe's most notorious example. By the late 1500s, this dynasty ruled over vast stretches of land: Austria, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, parts of Italy, and the Low Countries. Their secret weapon? Ruthless, systematic inbreeding. Generation after generation, Habsburg kings married their own cousins, nieces, and even uncles. Why? Because they believed mixing with lesser blood would weaken the line. In their minds, it was better to marry within the family, even if the consequences were horrifying. And horrifying they were. By the 17th century, the Habsburgs had become walking testaments to genetic decay. Thick jaws, protruding lips, enlarged tongues, the infamous Habsburg jaw that no portrait artist could hide. Many royal daughters born into this web of consanguinity suffered from deformities, infertility, mental disorders, or simply didn't survive infancy. One of the most chilling figures was Charles II of Spain, known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched King. Charles could barely speak, barely chew, and was often bedridden with mysterious illnesses. His family tree, a twisted knot of repeated unions, so tangled that his inbreeding coefficient was higher than if he'd been born from a brother-sister pairing. He died childless. The dynasty crumbled. The cost of this genetic obsession had finally caught up with them. But the Habsburgs were hardly alone. In ancient Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty, heirs of Alexander the Great, adopted similar practices. Cleopatra VII, yes, that Cleopatra was likely the product of sibling marriage, and married her own brother. Again, the goal was to keep the sacred bloodline untarnished. The result? Generations of fragile rulers, prone to madness, paranoia, and political disaster. But here's where it gets even darker. Historical records reveal that many royal daughters had no say in this process. They were groomed from birth, raised in isolation, and told their duty was to marry a cousin, uncle, or brother. Some resisted and were swiftly removed from history's pages. Others complied and paid the price with their bodies and minds. Letters from 18th century courts reveal chilling details. Princesses suffering repeated miscarriages, unable to walk after childbirth, trapped in loveless, incestuous unions with men twice their age. In private diaries, they speak of isolation, depression, and, in some cases, quiet suicide. And yet, the practice persisted. Why? Because for many rulers, a daughter's body was a tool. A means of forging alliances, securing power, and above all, preserving the purity of the line, no matter the human cost. And the most twisted irony, the very obsession that was supposed to protect their legacy became the force that destroyed it. But if you think that's the darkest chapter of this story, you haven't seen what comes next. You probably wouldn't have survived as a princess back then. Now tell me in the comments, would you have dared to defy your family's will if you were trapped in a royal bloodline? Or would you have sacrificed yourself for the dynasty? If the twisted legacies of the Habsburgs and Ptolemies were rooted in political strategy, what happens when obsession with blood purity becomes a full-blown ideology? Enter the courts of medieval and Renaissance Europe, where strange cults of royal blood began to form behind the polished facades of kings and queens. Some of these beliefs were ancient, others were whispered in secret, but they all shared one idea. Certain royal women were not merely human, they were vessels of divine essence, and that essence had to be preserved at all costs. Let's look at France in the 14th and 15th centuries. It wasn't enough to simply be of noble birth. Among certain branches of the Valois and Capetian dynasties, a belief took root that their female line carried a unique, almost mystical bloodline, traced, they claimed, back to Merovingian kings and even older mythic sources. Marrying an outsider, dilution of sacred blood, allowing a daughter to wed below her grade, potential spiritual catastrophe. As a result, endogamy intensified, not just among close cousins, but sometimes among half-siblings or uncle-niece pairings, often arranged in secret to maintain purity. Some royal genealogies from the period, when you trace them carefully, show horrifying loops. Girls born to a mother who was also an aunt, nephews marrying aunts, children whose genetic material was so compressed that diseases ran rampant by the age of 5 or 6. One such tragic figure was Blanche of Navarre, a princess celebrated in public, but whose life was a nightmare. Married at 12 to her 35-year-old uncle, her pregnancies were marked by illness and loss. Her son was born deaf, blind, and with a twisted spine. He did not survive infancy. Blanche herself vanished from court records at age 18. Some whispered she had died of complications. Others, that she had ended her life. But it wasn't just France. In Eastern Europe, particularly in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and among certain Russian princely lines, similar myths about royal essence circulated. The daughters of these lines were seen less as individuals and more as vessels, their value measured by their ability to produce pure heirs. A chilling example comes from the Gediminas dynasty, where sisters were sometimes married off to aging uncles or cousins after being kept isolated for years. Their only education centered on obedience and the duty of the blood. It gets worse. In the Vatican archives, yes, buried in certain censored church records, there are references to papal dispensations quietly issued to permit close marriage among certain Catholic dynasties. Why? Because those families argued that their daughters possessed rare bloodlines necessary for divine rule. And here's a modern twist. Geneticists who've analyzed remains from royal tombs across Europe confirm staggering levels of genetic compression among certain 16th and 17th century lineages. It's not just rumor, the science backs it up. Now, why does this matter today? Because some of these beliefs never died. Even in modern royal circles, obsession with ancestry persists. Private marriage arrangements, subtle pressures, old families insisting on maintaining dynastic purity, the echoes of those ancient, often tragic obsessions are still with us. And if you think the darkest secrets of these lineages are buried in the past, oh, the next stories will change your mind. Back then, you probably wouldn't have lasted long at those courts. But what do you think? Should modern monarchies finally abandon these bloodline obsessions? Or are some secrets too deeply rooted to ever disappear? Tell us below. And if this is making you think, just wait. Hit subscribe now because the next section dives even deeper, and you won't want to miss what's coming.